All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of webinars, or actually interviews, that I'm doing as part of our UCLA class to talk to professionals in college counseling. With me today, I have Rebecca Grappo. She is a specialist and an expert in working with TCK, third culture kids, and international students. And Becky, thank you for being here today. If you could...
Thank you for inviting me, Cindy.
I know many of our students are very interested in knowing different people's backgrounds and how they got into the work they do. So if you could share a little bit about who you are and why you do what you do, that would be very beneficial.
Okay. Well, I've had a very international life myself, having lived overseas many times in 10 different countries. And I've also worked in American international schools. So because of all the international background that I have, it's natural that I've been able to bring this into the work that I do. I also worked for the State Department for several years, where I was the education and youth officer, and I worked with foreign service families moving around the world. So that gave me even more exposure to kids coming and going from around the world. So when I started my private practice, I was still living that globally nomadic lifestyle myself. My husband was a career diplomat. And I established my practice thinking there must be a lot of expat Americans and international students who could use some guidance, not only with college applications, but also with boarding schools and specialty schools. We do all kinds of educational consulting in our practice. So that's how I got started. And in addition to doing college advising, I do a lot of public speaking and writing about the issues of transition and resiliency and moving kids around the world. So that ties right into what we're doing here as we talk about third culture kids and international students.
That brings up a really good point about transition and how do we prepare and what our role is as counselors. And that's one of the things that we're talking about in this class. So can you explain what a TCK student is and what the difference is between being a TCK and an international student?
Well, first of all, an international student might also be a TCK. So a TCK is a person who has spent a significant amount of their developmental years living in a country or a culture outside of their parents' home culture. They have ownership in many of the cultures in which they live, or they have a sense of belonging to many people in many of the cultures in which they live, but true ownership in none. And they find their sense of belonging usually in connection with other people who have had a similar background. So that's a paraphrase on the official definition. So let's take that into an example. So let's say that we're working with expat Americans where they've raised their children overseas for a significant amount of time. Well, that could be 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It just depends on what's significant for a particular student. And they're living outside of their country. And then eventually, but they don't have ownership. They're not immigrants. So let's say an American, for example, might have been living in Amsterdam. They will have absorbed many of the characteristics of Dutch culture. If they've gone to an international school, they've absorbed many of the characteristics of all the other nationalities of students who are in that school. They feel most connected when they're in that international type of environment. And that's when they're going to find, that's where they're going to find their sense of belonging. So when we think about advising that kind of student, when that student comes to the United States, let's assume that they're an American passport holder, we cannot assume that they are automatically going to feel at home on any college campus around the U.S., or just because they're in the United States doesn't make them feel internally like they're at home. So when we come up with the list for that kind of student, usually they're asking for a campus to be more outward focused, more international, to have a sizable number of international students on campus. I get the question all the time, well, where are the best schools for TCKs? And the answer is, it really depends. There's a certain go-to list that a lot of kids tend to want to apply to from international schools overseas, but that doesn't make them the only schools that are good for TCKs. And there's a lot more that can be discussed about that particular topic, but that's it in a nutshell. Now, if we also talk about international students, so for example, I work with a lot of kids coming out of the Middle East because we spent many years there, and especially, let's say, Dubai or Abu Dhabi. It could be that it's a Lebanese student, for example, that has grown up in Dubai, where the parents are Lebanese, but they've never actually lived there, so their TCK is living in Dubai, and they're going to come to the U.S. as an international student. So again, all these complexities about answering the question, where do you fit in? Where do you belong? Where is home? Where are you going to be comfortable? What kind of environment are you going to be comfortable in? And fitting in with the culture on an American campus. So what I hear from a lot of TCKs is that going to college can be a really big challenge for them. So it's the first time away from home, just like all the other kids, getting used to college, just like all the other kids. But they also, in many cases, are adjusting to a country and a culture that might appear to be their own, but it's not. And it doesn't feel comfortable like that. So there are other issues to helping them to feel like they're at home and adjusting on their college campus. So.
One of the things, one of the articles that I had students read is about, was a definition of diversity. And the author, Roxanne, coins the phrase or uses the phrase authentic or cultural authenticity. So as you think about that for the students that you work with, how do they portray or communicate their cultural authenticity if they're identifying with very many different cultures?
Wow, that's a great question, and I wish we could talk about that for an hour. Because I think that's a really great question. Lots of different ways that I could answer it. I think that authenticity, I think a lot of these students are searching and questioning to answer that question for themselves during this experience. I think that there's a diversity of thought, just like there can be diversity of race and ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. And one of the things that I really think is important is that we expand our definition of diversity, especially when we're talking about diversifying a campus, and that what a TCK or an international student can bring to the classroom and to the dorm and to the activities and everything else is just a different perspective, a different view of life. And I think that's really important. That's diversity of thought, even if on the outside they look like everybody else. I also think that in coming up with their own identity, and again, this could be a really long, involved topic, but in coming up with their own identity, a lot of students that I'm working with are thinking about these things deeply. Maybe the first time they really think about this is in their college essay, which we should talk about quickly. But also just, what does this experience mean and how are they going to connect with other people? How are they going to share their stories, which have a different setting, and be accepted by their peers without it look like they're trying to show off or be fancy? Mm-hmm. And so we see a lot of students who don't want to talk about their background or flaunt their background. But it's all about, finding that connection with other students on campus. I often advise my students, you're going to have to find other things that you have in common with the students that you meet on a new campus. Like maybe you all are going to be involved in the same community service project or the same political action group or the international club, but you're going to have to find new things that you have in common because it's not going to be so prevalent to find other people who are going to be just like you. Right. And maybe in a way that's the point. So the other point that I'd like to make about this is that when kids talk about fit and finding a place where they belong, I get it. I understand why they want that. But I also warn them, if you want to be special, if you want to use your background in a way that's really going to stand out and make you very attractive in the admissions process, if you apply to the same schools where everybody else is applying, they've already seen it and read it before. And it's not very it's impressive, but it's not something that's unique and different. So if you really want to stand out and be in a place where people are going to maybe offer you a special incentive to enroll, you have to accept the fact that you're going to be in the minority. flip side of that is that you're going to be in the minority, and maybe you're not going to find as many people that you can relate to, you can identify with. But just to give an example, Tufts reads 700 applications a year from TCKs. So if you write that I'm now a citizen of the world because I've lived around the world, they've read that essay before thousands of times. And that's not going to be enough. Just because you were raised overseas is not going to be enough to get across that admissions threshold. So that kind of, we went in a couple different directions with that answer, but it's all important.
It is. And that points out to the fact that it's not cut and dried, and every student situation is going to be different. And that's where what our role as counselors, and that's one of the things we covered last week, is varies. And we're building that knowledge and expertise so that we know and can help our students and the families. But when do at some point it's going to go beyond what I, as a regular counselor, work with. And so at what point would you recommend that counselors, especially if you're at a high school or even if you're at an international school, all your students are falling into one of these characteristics. So what do you do when you don't know the answers?
Well, first, that's a complicated question too. So I think that, on the one hand, we want to learn. If there's something we don't know, we want to learn. But on the other hand, if you're not used to working with international students, there are all kinds of twists and turns that can take place. I was teaching the course at UC Irvine, American College Consulting for the International Student. The course is still being offered. I'm no longer teaching it. There are 2 other great instructors for that now. But one of the chapters that I did with my adult students was landmines in the application process. And so just trying to point out what some of those landmines are as you're working with an international student that are going to be very different from working with your, let's say, I'm going to use North American now because we're just talking about American colleges. At the moment, if I could say one thing is this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. Mm-hmm. This is getting more and more global all the time and getting more complicated all the time. So just for this conversation, I'm going to keep it focused on American. So when we're talking about American college admissions, there are all kinds of landmines that could come into play. And so I would really advise somebody, if you're new to this and you don't really know that much about it, you should refer this out. Within our professional organizations, we're working very, very hard to raise the professional standards of people who are doing work internationally, to recognize this as a specialty that takes years of experience to acquire. And even those of us who have many years of experience have our own small little networking groups that we meet together over Skype and in email groups, and we bounce cases off of each other. Because even after years of experience, there are lots of things that are perplexing to us, and we need each other in order to make sure that we don't drop the ball and have it affect a student. So yes, learn. If you happen to be a member of IACAC, the Global Consulting Committee has been working very hard on an international roadmap that gives a lot of professional development opportunities laid out for counselors, consultants to become even better at what they do when working with international students. The sessions that are offered either at IACAC or the International IACAC, or if the HECA or IECA conferences that are devoted to international students, NACAC, etc. These are places where you can go to learn more about working with international students, as well as TCKs. So we want to be really careful. We've got a child's life in our hands, so we have to be careful.
Absolutely. And thanks for mentioning all those different organizations. I've posted a document that has links, but I'll need to add the OACAC because that's a key one, especially for the international perspective.
Well, and actually just this month in January, the name was changed to IACAC and voted on by the membership to become the International Association of College Admissions Counselors. There's a new logo, new website, new name. And the reason they did that was to reflect the fact that this is changing, that this is not just about American college consulting anymore. or American College Counseling, but we've got consultants who are working globally, that we've got international school counselors who are sending kids around the world, and that it's not just the United States or even North America anymore. And that's what I was referring to earlier in our conversation. This whole thing is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
It definitely. Well, thank you for that, because we'll definitely have people look that up. And you mentioned something about the essay. So in closing, let's go ahead and have you cover a little bit about what your recommendations are in terms of essays for students.
A couple of things. Number one is that depending on what kind of education the student has had, they may or may not be used to writing an essay. So I find that often I'm taking on the role of a writing teacher, in addition to just helping them brainstorm essay topics. So really helping them to develop that essay into something that is going to be an example of good writing. The second thing is that if you're working with international students and English is not their first language, you don't want to over-edit, because they're also going to be presenting, theoretically, a standardized test score or a TOEFL score. English is a foreign language, or an IELTS. And the writing has to be consistent, and the letters of recommendation from their English teacher, it all has to be consistent with their level of writing. So if we as consultants, counselors, over-edit an essay and it's too polished and it doesn't match the level of achievement that they've had in their academic life, then that's going to be suspect. So we don't want it to be too perfect. And yet we're there to help them. So, this is something, again, we would spend a whole week talking about this whole topic. The other thing is that I really, really encourage students to look for a story that exemplifies the point that they're trying to make. So, for example, if somebody wants to show their global understanding about a particular, that I've grown up around the world, and therefore I'm very attuned to different cultures and peoples around the world, and I really love diversity. Instead of writing, I've grown up around the world and I really love diversity in cultures and people because I've had all these great opportunities. Instead, if they could tell a story of one thing that happened, and the story illustrates all those things without them having to state them and list them, and the story will be memorable. And some of the stories that my international students in TCKs have told have been so incredible that I can still remember that student that year and the story that they told in their essay and where they ended up going to school. Stories are memorable, and that's what we want to happen. I tell them, don't forget, that whoever is reading your admissions file. I had one admissions officer answer my email at 10 o'clock at night. It was midnight on her time zone. I'm like, what are you doing answering my email? And she's like, I'm reading files at home. So that just goes to show you that if you're going to be presenting your file to an admissions officer, remember it might be midnight. They might be really tired.
Right.
And if you do the same old sleeper essay that they've read 1,000 times, it's not going to make an impression.
Right. Oh, great sage words of advice. And I think that is something that working with all our students is helping them to tell their stories. But for our, as you say, the international TCK students, they've never had to do that before at the same level, and keep preserving. It goes back to that cultural authenticity, just their own authenticity, and preserving their second language perspective, and just their perspective is what brings and makes their applications authentic and personal, and helping them to understand that they do have a story to tell. It's so key.
And
Becky,
that's what makes it so fun.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your
You're
time.
welcome.
If people have questions or anything, what should I have them do?
They can certainly send me an email, rebecca@rnginternational.com.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Great.
Have a great day.
All right. Thanks for the invitation, Sydney.
You're very welcome.
Cindy. Great.
That's
Thank
okay.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Bye.